I was 15 years old. I sat on the steps outside St. Alice's Church in Upper Darby, Pennsylvania, just outside of West Philadelphia. My mom had a hand on my back. I vomited. I vomited Coke. Fate, it seems, is not without a sense of irony. That's the Matrix. I looked at my mom and knew, in that moment, I was a diabetic. I knew because I was diagnosed 6 months earlier when I was 14. My eye was swelling shut, like a big black eye. Just before Thanksgiving, I went to the hospital and they gave me prednisone. They kept me on too high a dose for too long. And there are many other factors, like genetics and things we don't know yet. 1 month later, right before Christmas, I was a diabetic. I came into the hospital with a blood sugar over 700 in diabetic ketoacidosis. A few more days and I might have died. For the next 6 months, I went through my honeymoon period. That might happen after your diabetes diagnosis. Your pancreas might make enough insulin to cover your needs for a while. Then your beta cells burn out. You're a diabetic for life. For the next 20 years, I managed my diabetes well enough that my doctors didn't pay much attention to me. In fact, I rarely saw the endocrinologist. That's the doctor for diabetes. I always saw the nurse practitioner. Or when I started at CHOP, when I was diagnosed, I saw a physician's assistant. From what I was told at that time, CHOP was renowned as a top diabetes center for children. That was the late 1990s. My physician's assistant at CHOP told me I could eat whatever I wanted, as long as I counted carbs and dosed insulin for those carbs. After a few months of showing I was good at counting carbs and dosing insulin and managing diabetes, she told me they could fast track me to get an insulin pump. No more injections, and I could eat whatever I wanted. That was awesome. But I'll come back to this. Now, you're a parent. Your child just got diagnosed with diabetes. What do? You're getting older. You just got diagnosed with diabetes. What do? You're me. You're 14 years old. You got diabetes. What do? Hi all, my name's Matt Dever. Today we'll review my current top 5 actions to reduce diabetes risk. Before we get to that, let me explain what happened to me the last 3 years. That's what led me to discover what I'll share today. Now you might look at this slide and think, what on earth is he doing? On the left is me in my borrowed hyperbaric oxygen chamber to help reduce migraines. On the right is me wearing special glasses in the eye specialist's office to diagnose my double vision. Notice the toys in the corner. They don't see many adults, but I feel like a big kid anyway. Now I'm showing this because it represents the last 3 years of my life and the depths I dug into to fix my issues. This is not a short presentation. Watch as much or little as you want. Maybe just skip to any of the top 5 actions for reducing diabetes risk that you're interested in, and I'll show that in a couple slides. See, I created this presentation for me and anyone like me motivated to reduce their diabetes risk. If you're anyone else, don't feel bad tapping out and doing something else. Now, I also created this presentation because much of what I was told about diabetes at the beginning was wrong. And that's not the fault of any doctors, providers, or anyone else. It's just what everyone thought back then about diabetes. And unfortunately, most providers still think this way now. It pains me that I lived 20 years of my life ultra motivated to manage my diabetes well, but with the wrong mental model. I cried thinking about it. Now, why? I look like a healthy guy. maybe in the top 1% of fit people you might meet. But I don't know what my cells look like from the damage done over the last 20 years. And unfortunately, I've felt some of that damage the last few years. And it scares me. And you might hear about me having some bad outcomes in the next 20 years. But it's not because of the actions I'm taking now. Since I started taking these actions, I only feel better. And all my blood tests only look better. I'll talk about that more at the end. You see, 3 years ago, I felt like my health fell off a cliff. I had dizziness, lightheadedness, and proprioception issues. Yeah, I learned there are at least 3 different ways to differentiate dizziness. I had light and audio sensitivity and non-stop migraine-like headaches. I had gut issues, an inability to effectively digest protein, a candida overgrowth, and I smelled like yeast. Just ask my wife. On top of that, I had visual issues. Sometimes I had double vision, and sometimes I just had eye teaming issues. That's when your eyes don't work together. Individually, they're fine, but they don't align properly. So your sight is blurry, or one eye takes over, and you lose some depth perception and clarity in your field of vision. And during this time, my sleep was awful. In part, I think, from those gut issues, and part from my anxiety, because neither I nor my doctors had identified all these issues at that time. So we were looking for a single root cause and fix. Now, I've solved most of these issues, except the vision. And there are many causes, many diabetes related, and a few not. So at a certain point, I decided to upgrade my diabetes game. I thought it was a factor in my gut issues, my migraines, and my sleep. And I was right. What comes next is what I learned. Before that, remember, I'm not a doctor. Work with your doctor. Most doctors and endocrinologists haven't caught up on this advice. It can take 10 to 20 years for modern research to make its way into medical practice. And I doubt that a majority of doctors would agree that the research I'm talking about today and what I'm suggesting is true. But there's good evidence from the doctors I'll talk about, like Dr. Bernstein, Dr. Fung, and others. So the summary of that is, you might need to find a new doctor. And it might be hard to find one with experience or an open mind for using these actions. Look for online support groups that might be able to provide recommendations for providers, like Type 1 Grit for the Bernstein method. We'll talk about next. I'll have more resources at the end. Now, one more reminder, all actions are trade-offs. There's a benefit and a risk. For me, the risk of these actions is low, but you have to accept any risk anytime you make a decision. But for anyone, particularly diabetics, not doing anything is a decision. If you're on the path to diabetes, following the same path is a huge risk. And I think it's worth a little risk of alternative options to course correct. But you have to assess those risks, that value, and decide for yourself. Now, if you are a friend or family member at risk of diabetes and asked me, Matt, what do you do to reduce your diabetes risk? Or what should I do? Well, these 5 actions are what I tell you. They're my current top 5 actions to reduce diabetes risk. They're in a rough priority order based on the impact. Number 1 and number 2 are 100x in terms of impacts compared to most of what you'll hear from people. They work. Providers have used these methods successfully on thousands of patients to reduce or even eliminate the need for insulin, or improve stability in glucose levels for type 1s like me. Now, if you're a diabetic already, number 1, reducing carbs and insulin will make a huge noticeable impact. If you're not a diabetic, it will also make a huge impact. But it might be harder to see since you still make some insulin, but this will help give your pancreas a break. And before we get into number 1, you should know I'm not anti-carb. Eat whatever diet you want. I just don't think most carbs except vegetables are a good choice for those at risk from diabetes. And I'll explain why later. Number 2 is to reduce your eating window, which is like a short-term fast. Now, if you're pre-diabetic, obese, or type 2 but diabetic already, this is your 100x action, like number 1 for type 1s. With practice, I go further and work with a medical professional on multi-day fasts. Again, I'll explain why. The rest are relatively self-explanatory, except maybe number 5, but we'll get to that later. Now again, these are the same actions I'd take if I was a diabetic, pre-diabetic, overweight, obese, or had a family history of diabetes. For non-diabetics or pre-diabetics, these actions can prevent or delay getting diabetes. Imagine like you're on your honeymoon period now, like I talked about for me earlier. You're still making insulin, but maybe your beta cells, those are the cells in your pancreas that make insulin. Maybe those beta cells are dying, whether you're type 1 or type 2. Over 90% of diabetics nowadays are type 2, and you can preserve your ability to make insulin if you take the right actions early enough. And some type 1s can even preserve some beta cell function. For diabetics, existing diabetics, these actions can mitigate your risk of complications, reduce the cognitive burden of diabetes, and they can make you feel better. And I know that because they have for me. Now let's start with the story of the old engineer, which leads to our first action. Around the time I was in that hyperbaric chamber, I listened to a Dr. Peter Attia podcast with Dr. Jake Kushner. Kushner treats kids with diabetes to achieve normal blood glucose levels at Texas Children's. That's normal blood sugars. For insulin-dependent diabetics like me, that feels impossible. Now, Kushner mentioned a book, Dr. Bernstein's Diabetes Solution. This is Dr. Bernstein. He's the old engineer. Dr. Bernstein was diagnosed at 11 years old, way back in 1945, with type 1 diabetes. And he's still alive. That's important because he might be the oldest type 1 diabetic in the world. You didn't live that long with type 1 diabetes back then. Now, by his 30s, he had severe complications. He tried exercising and everything else he was supposed to do as a diabetic. Nothing worked. And now he had a wife and kids. Dr. Bernstein also had a degree in engineering and saw an ad for a new device, like a glucometer. Dr. B started testing and recording experiments multiple times per day. He reversed most of his complications. Bernstein wrote to medical journals with his approach. And what did they do? They ignored him. What did he do? He got a medical degree. You can still visit him. His practice is in New Jersey as of the time of this recording. And I hope we can all charge $10,000 for our time when we're almost 90 years old, like he does. It costs $10,000 for an appointment. The receptionist said you don't need an appointment with him unless you can't follow directions. You can read most of his book online for free. I'll have that link at the end. And you can find the Type 1 Grit community on Facebook to help support you. And he has hundreds of videos with millions of hits, hour-long videos. This old engineer is my diabetic hero. But what does he tell you to do? What's his method? Why should we care? Bernstein's method relies on the law of small numbers, which was given to him by his diabetic friend Kanji Ishikawa, the longest surviving type 1 diabetic in Japan, at least as of the time Bernstein wrote his book. Now, you can read the law on the slide. Big inputs make big mistakes, small inputs make small mistakes. Most diabetics count carbohydrates to determine their insulin dose. If I eat 10 grams of carbohydrates, I give myself 1 unit of insulin. And that's like the blue line in the graph for small carb input. If I eat 100 grams of carbohydrates, I give myself 10 units of insulin. That's like the red line in the graph for big carb input. As a diabetic, you expect rapid-acting insulins will cause your blood glucose to return to normal 2 to 4 hours after that insulin dose. And that seems simple, but it's not. The graph shows that. Bigger inputs lead to more variability, even if you do everything perfect. Let's look into that a bit more. Check out these 42 factors that affect blood glucose from Diatribe. It's not just giving yourself insulin. It's not just counting carbs and giving yourself insulin. It's thinking about as many of these 42 factors as your brain can handle. And my insulin goes through fat tissue, so there is approximately a 15-minute delay on the effect of that insulin relative to you. You are normal if you're a non-diabetic. I call you lucky non-diabetics normals. You normals have insulin delivered directly into your bloodstream. And a cycle time increase of 15 minutes doesn't sound like much. But a Twinkie, a Coke, or even a banana skyrockets your blood sugar in 15 minutes. And on top of that, my liver doesn't release glycogen as well as you normals to prevent lows. In fact, I don't make another hormone called amylin that reduces glycogen release after eating and slows digestion. So I have more glucose circulating, faster digestion, and slower insulin. Sounds like a recipe for disaster, and it is. Diabetes isn't just a lack of insulin or a lack of effective insulin. It's a broken system with broken feedback loops, broken cycle times, and broken safety checks. Now back to the law of small numbers. Bernstein would tell you the larger the insulin dose, the more unpredictable the absorption. And digestion is unpredictable too, the longer you're diabetic, because you might get mild to severe neuropathy, which affects nerves that control your gut motility, which means sometimes you digest food normally and sometimes it's slow, and you don't always know when it's fast and when it's slow. So the law of small numbers for diabetics boils down to use as little insulin as possible to achieve normal blood glucose levels. Well, how do we do that? How do we reduce insulin needs? Look at this graph showing the effects of blood sugar from different macronutrients, carbs, fat, and protein. It also shows a colored dotted line for each macronutrient, representing the insulin action after you dose for each. If you were diabetic and saw this, which macronutrient would you reduce? Carbs, fat, or protein? If you say carbs, you're right. That doesn't mean carbs are bad. I repeat, carbs are not bad. But certain carbs are bad for diabetics or those at risk for diabetes. Sugar and starches are bad for insulin-dependent diabetics. If you still produce insulin, you might get away with normal glucose levels eating sugar and starches for a while. But read more of Dr. Bernstein's book for more on why this isn't a good idea. And it's better to learn more now than when it's too late and all your insulin-producing cells are gone. Now again, insulin isn't bad. In fact, what happens when you have too much or too little insulin? This slide shows my mental model for what happens when you use more insulin. It looks like a scientific graph based on a published report. It's not. Read the fine print in the title that says Matt's mental model. Now, what happens when you use too much insulin? That's over on the right. Well, you gain weight. That's the y-axis on this graph. And what happens when you produce no insulin? That's the left. You lose weight, and then you die. If you're a type 1 diabetic like me, that's almost what happened when I was diagnosed and hadn't been producing insulin or much insulin for weeks or longer. So insulin isn't bad. It's required for life. But too much is bad and can lead to a much earlier death. Gaining weight and using lots of insulin are typically what happens when you get type 2 diabetes, but not always. Again, that's the right side of the graph. And the 100 units of insulin scale on this model is not precise. But if you're producing or using 100 units of insulin per day, there's a good chance you're at high risk for type 2 diabetes or already a type 2 diabetic. Now, insulin is anabolic for muscle and fat. So again, you need it. Some bodybuilders even inject insulin, even though they're not diabetic, to try to gain muscle. So if you're training like a bodybuilder, it might help, but I don't consider that health. Personally, I don't think bodybuilding is very healthy, but that's just me. But you need some amount of insulin to stay alive. Again, that's the left side of the graph. If you make no insulin, you will likely die in days, 2 weeks, 2 months. This is what happened before the discovery of insulin, back in the 1920s by Banting and Best. That's what happened to type 1 diabetics like me. Eventually, we would make no insulin. When I was diagnosed at 14, I had lost 20 pounds, and I didn't have 20 pounds to lose. I was a skinny teenager already, and I got skinnier right before I was diagnosed. That was not good. My blood glucose was around 750. My breath smelled like fruit. I was lethargic, drinking gallons and gallons of fluid, and it was going right through me. I was in diabetic ketoacidosis. Another week or two, or maybe longer, and I would die. So you need some amount of insulin. I even heard of a type 1 diabetic using only 5 units of insulin per day, along with 5 to 10 miles of walking, and again, no carbs except vegetables. And he's very healthy, but he still needs those 5 units. Then in the middle of this graph, there's this trough that represents no weight gain. And again, the amount of insulin there, any of these numbers, isn't precise. It's not precise to say 0 weight gain. There will always be ups and downs, but relative to those extremes on the left and the right, it's minimal. The point of the middle is there's a sweet spot for how much insulin you want to produce and use. Generally, less is better. For me, personally, to live the longest, I want to use the least amount of insulin possible per day. There's no hard research I've seen on that, but from everything we've learned, that seems to make sense. Less insulin keeps you lean, mean, and minimizes the risk of metabolic disorders, which increase the risk for every other disease that kills you that I can think of, or that has a big impact on mortality. And remember, insulin is just like other hormones in this respect. Insulin is anabolic. That means pro-growth for fat and muscle. Testosterone is anabolic for muscle. Cortisol is catabolic for muscle and fat, I think. Now, insulin is not bad. It's required for life. Too much insulin is bad. Just like too much testosterone is bad, or too much cortisol. No cortisol means no energy to wake up in the morning. So even catabolic hormones are required for life. But back to diabetes and the law of small numbers. What should we do based on what we've learned the last few slides? How can we use the law of small numbers practically? Well, this is my number one recommendation for anyone at risk of diabetes or already a diabetic. This is a 100x change in terms of impact. As you saw on the graph a couple slides back, carbs require the most insulin, gram for gram, to bring glucose levels back to normal. Less carbs means less insulin, which means if you're already a diabetic, you get more predictable glucose levels. If you're not a diabetic yet, you give your pancreas a break from producing so much insulin, which is important. And also, your body doesn't get as much of a pro-growth anabolic signal from insulin, which is key to losing weight. Now, sugars, starches, and even fruit are what you should avoid, reduce, limit, or ideally eliminate as much as possible. Remember, that's a recommendation for diabetics or people at risk. Normal people, keep eating whatever it is that normal people eat. I don't know anymore. Diabetics and those at risk should eat mostly protein, fat, and vegetables to reduce insulin needs. Vegetables, most of them, do not spike your glucose levels, so they're fine to eat. Protein converts to glucose, but much more slowly, again, like you saw on that slide a couple back. So it's easier to dose and control the effect of glucose from protein predictably. And again, fat is not bad for you. We don't have time to get into why, but check the resources or ping me if you're interested. Now, in case you don't believe all those stock images on carbs, protein, and fat and the impact on glucose, I ran an experiment. A fun experiment. My original plan was to eat a donut. I searched far and wide for the best donuts I could find, because I don't eat many donuts, and I love donuts. It was Saturday. The bakery only sold donuts on Sunday. I was disappointed. I'd heard rumors of a heavenly apricot Danish at this bakery, So the donut experiment became the Danish experiment. And this is a graph of my glucose levels that day. Can anyone guess roughly when I ate the Danish? Pretty easy, right? Now you might just think I did a bad job managing the Danish. Well, here's what I did. That would be wrong. Here's everything I did, and I did it exactly right and by the book. I won't explain all of this, and you might question some of my decisions, and that's fine. It's hard to make every decision the same way or perfectly every time. But I dosed my insulin 20 minutes before I ate the Danish. I walked a half hour with normal glucose levels, and I even split the Danish with my wife. Thank you for taking away part of that apricot drug from me. And then I went on a roller coaster ride. The only reason I didn't crash is I paid such close attention to my glucose levels. Now, without sugars and starches and fruit, I don't have to pay as much attention. You get your brain back, you get your sleep back, you get your life back. And if you're pre-diabetic, you might get your pancreas back, working again. And I still got the donuts on Sunday, and my blood sugar rose again. And I won't eat donuts again for another year. I love donuts, but they don't love me. I show this box of donuts so you know, I give in to temptation just like you. I just minimize the frequency as much as possible. There's really nothing in life you can't enjoy as a diabetic. But I savor those moments more because I can't have them frequently and live a long life. And unfortunately, more of society is joining me on this journey. Let me show you why. First, this slide does not prove anything. It shows correlation, not causation. But if it sounds like a duck and smells like a duck and looks like a duck, it just might be a duck. And this looks like sugar has something to do with the increase in obesity in our society. Which makes sense to me because eating more sugar requires more insulin in a linear fashion. And insulin is anabolic, like I mentioned earlier, particularly if you're not a bodybuilder or a pro-level athlete. Eating lots of sugar will cause that insulin to store those calories as fat. And by the way, this study shows the average person in the West eating about 125 grams of sugar per day. Do you know how much blood sugar the average person has in their bloodstream at a time? 5 grams. That's for the average person with a blood glucose of about 100 milligrams per deciliter. That's 1 teaspoon of glucose. Do you know how many teaspoons of glucose diabetics would have? Let's assume if your blood glucose is 200 milligrams per deciliter, you're a diabetic. And that would be 2 teaspoons of glucose in your bloodstream at a given moment. 1 teaspoon is normal, 2 teaspoons is diabetic. Now that doesn't mean just eat 1 less teaspoon of sugar a day to avoid diabetes. It means the physiologic difference between diabetic and non-diabetic in your blood is small. And again, the point is eating more sugar as a society seems to lead to more obesity. And don't think it's just sugar that's the problem. Refined carbohydrates and even complex carbohydrates quickly break down into sugar. And if you have pancreatic beta cell function to handle that, great, you're normal. If you're at risk from diabetes, I'd avoid them. Now, here's one more like that last one. Again, this slide does not prove anything. Correlation, not causation. But you can see that once the low-fat guidelines were introduced in the US, obesity started going up. And my mind says that insulin is driving this. I wish we had a measure on everyone's insulin in the US on our watches and fitness trackers starting in the 1970s, just so we could see. We can't, so we're guessing. And if you need information on why eating higher natural fats isn't bad for you, read the Bernstein book, read Dr. Fung, who I'll mention later, and listen to Dr. Atia's podcast, which I'll have in the resources. Atia even has a great presentation out there on YouTube dissecting the research on the low-fat guidelines. But nowadays, what you believe generally comes down to trust. You'll find someone else presenting the opposite perspective, and that's frustrating. I know. I've read those other research studies. But high fat works for me. and low carb works much better than high carb. Now, there's a small subset of people who do need to be careful with how much saturated fat they consume. Again, use the resources I'll provide. Do your own research if you fall into this small subset. Now, next, number 2. This would be my top recommendation if you're overweight or obese and pre-diabetic or diabetic. It might be easier to fast after you've reduced carbs and insulin for a while with that first action, but maybe you tackle this one first. If you're getting diabetes and you're overweight, solving the problem is not just about carbs, glucose, and insulin. It's about everything you eat, including fat. So reduce everything. If your body has too much fat, then use fasting to train your body to burn that fat, to lose the weight, reduce your metabolic issues, and feel better. Now, it's hard to do that, but not impossible. And it's way better than death or amputations or all the other problems you might get from diabetes. I'm not the expert. Find a doctor who specializes in fasting as a treatment protocol, but they may be hard to find. Now, for me, I would start with an easier way by cutting my feeding window. And that's the time from your first bite of food to the last bite of food in your day. Decades ago, that window was typically much smaller. Nowadays, people eat for 16 hours sometimes, from when they wake up until just before bed. So if that's you, start by reducing to 12 hours. Then gradually reduce further down to maybe 4 hours, or even one meal a day. Now, you don't have to do this every day. You can do it every other day, or try a different model. But when you get down to 4 hours, you also don't have to do 4 hours every day. Maybe the day after a hard workout, you eat for 8 hours. Maybe you listen to your body. But remember, your body will always tell you you're hungry at some point, even if you fast for a few days. That doesn't mean you have to listen. Unless you have a body fat percentage around 5% or less, you'll be fine if you don't eat when you're hungry, barring other medical issues, which we don't have time to discuss. Now, time-restricted feeding and multi-day fasting has been used as a successful treatment for type 2 diabetes. You can read Dr. Fung's book, The Complete Guide to Fasting, or check out his book, The Diabetes Code. I'll have those in the resources. Eventually, we want to work our way up to multi-day fasting. So let's talk about Dr. Fung's model. So here's another part of the diabetes burden, besides those 42 factors I showed. What many type 2 diabetics are told might be wrong, or partially wrong. The insulin resistance model can be misleading because of the lock and key analogy. That's the classic model for diabetes, where insulin is the key to unlock the cell door to allow glucose inside. When your cells are resistant to insulin, it can't open the door. Again, Dr. Jason Fung explains that model doesn't work for many reasons, including you need insulin for growth and fat storage and other things, and that all seems to work fine even when you're verging on type 2 diabetes. So he uses a suitcase analogy. If you can't put more clothes in the suitcase, it could be the lock is broken, or it could be the suitcase is full. And it's the same if you apply glucose. If glucose is the clothes and the suitcase is your cell. If your cell is full of glucose, it might be hard to let more in, which may be why type 2 diabetics need more and more insulin to clear that glucose from your bloodstream. It's not enough to just jam that glucose into cells. It still leads to complications from diabetes. Even if you have relatively normal glucose levels, you get the impacts and the mortality decrease. Read his book to understand that better. Dr. Fung has treated thousands of patients successfully with fasting to reduce glucose, insulin, and fat. And again, I'm not the expert. Look for the podcast link from Dr. Attia if you want to listen to what he says about this model, or again, read his books. So whether you believe what I just said or not, it's a great example of how framing a problem differently leads to different solutions and results. I want you to understand these two frames. One way to frame the type 2 diabetes problem is that it's caused by insulin resistance, like that bar, vertical bar in the middle. Insulin resistance led doctors to give patients more insulin and medications that mitigate the problem in the short term. But those results are not good. Generally, people are getting more diabetes, more obesity, and higher mortality from this model. Another way to frame the problem is type 2 diabetes is caused by too much insulin. That's the vertical bar on the right. That leads you to try to reduce insulin levels. And that's how it works for every other endocrine disorder. Too much thyroid hormone, reduce it. Too little thyroid hormone, increase it. But the thing is, there are drugs for those changes. There's no drug that reduces your insulin level directly. So making the change to reduce insulin is harder. But when you reduce insulin, it works. Your results are better. For many or even most type 2s, diabetes goes away. You get off your insulin and your medications. So if it was me and I was type 2 or diagnosed as pre-diabetic, obese, overweight, or had a family history of type 2, I wouldn't just reduce my eating window. I would fast for days at a time. Take the long view of your life for a moment. Over the course of a lifetime, you may have accumulated excess fat for many reasons, but likely eating more than what you need is a big one. So what's the fastest way to counteract that lifetime of fat accumulation? Stop eating. Again, it's easy to say and hard to do, but I've done it, and it's easier than I thought. I'll show that next. Now again, how can we make fasting easier? Like I said a couple slides ago, I'd reduce my eating window down to 4 hours. For me, I would stop eating around 10 p.m. and then not eat again until 6 p.m. the next day. 6 p.m. would start my 4-hour feeding window, and I'd stop again at 10 p.m. And once I felt relatively comfortable with this 4-hour eating window, I'd try a full day or a multi-day fast, maybe 2 or 3 days. And remember, being okay with fasting doesn't mean you're not hungry. You will be hungry fasting. But you shouldn't be lethargic or have other major symptoms. If you are, or if you're uncomfortable in any way, stop your fast immediately. Really, you should work with a medical professional if you're pursuing multi-day fasts, especially if you have other medical conditions. Now, this image shows the example of doing a full day fast a couple days per week, or alternate day fasting, maybe even with low calories some of those days. For multi-day fasting, ideally you'd string a couple days together or more. And remember, you don't have to use the same schedule every day or every week if you're reducing your eating window or fasting. For me, I listen to my body and how I'm feeling. I try to ignore the hunger, and sometimes I push through it, sometimes I don't. And again, this is not necessarily my recommendation for most people because it's hard and you need support. You need your family bought in. You need the people in your life bought in. And finding broader support can be hard to find. But look for a medical professional who can support you. Unless you're dying or getting amputated or another severe complication with type 2, I would start with reducing your eating window. If it were me, then progress to this, again, with support. And why would I do this? Again, it's because I want to lose fat as quickly as possible, and not eating would be the fastest way, like I said. But this would also give my pancreas the biggest break from producing so much insulin, which would help preserve beta cell function. Those are the cells that produce insulin, beta cells. Those are destroyed when you develop type 1 diabetes. But something similar can also happen with type 2. Read Bernstein's book for more on that. You don't want to lose those cells. That makes diabetes harder to manage. Now, what happens when you fast for a few days? Well, these are my stats from a 3-day fast I did back in December 2019. You can see that multi-day fasting reduces insulin use, and it switches your body to using ketones and burning body fat. I lost almost 1% body fat. At 190 pounds, that's almost 2 pounds of body fat in just 3 days. And that's almost exactly the number of calories my body would need to cover my basal metabolic rate and the calories burned from activity over 3 days. And I expect I certainly burned some of my glycogen reserves. But that's a minimal amount of calories, maybe 800, compared to the 7,000 calories from 2 pounds of fat, roughly. And maybe most importantly for anyone at risk from diabetes, I cut my insulin use in half. And really, my normal insulin use is typically around 40 to 50 units. So 15 units, like you see in those days 1, 2, and 3, That's about 1/3 of my typical daily insulin. But for context, I spent a year regularly limiting my eating window to 2 to 8 hours, several days per week before I did this. I knew what to monitor, I knew what supplements to take, and what symptoms to check, and when to quit if things were going wrong. Read the Dr. Fung book and the references. I'll have more of his books on my website at the end. You can do your own research and find a doctor to help you do this the right way. Now, why did I fast, even though I'm a type 1 diabetic and I don't have excess body fat? Well, one reason is just to get the experience. But another is to trigger autophagy, meaning the body reusing, recycling, and discarding dead cells, because I had so many health issues recently. But we can't measure that, and I'm not the expert. But really, the last reason is longer fasts produce more ketones. Now, why is that important for type 1s? Well, ketones give you an alternative energy source. When my ketones are around 1 millimolar, I'm less hungry. I can typically fast all day with only mild hunger in the middle of the day. But on top of that, ketones protect me from low blood glucose, and that's what this image shows. This isn't a keto speech. You don't need to eat keto exactly to get most of the benefits described in this presentation, except maybe one. The image is from a study from George Cahill from many years ago. Cahill fasted people for weeks, then injected insulin to take their blood sugar down to around 20 milligrams per deciliter, or 1 millimolar. Now, you couldn't get this study approved nowadays because it sounds like you're trying to kill people. 20 milligrams per deciliter is when most people are at risk for going into a diabetic coma and then sometimes die. Not these people. They were perfectly fine. No symptoms, no issues, no death. Now, I'm not recommending anyone do this experiment, but why were these subjects okay? Well, ketones provide an alternative fuel source for your brain. For me personally, I notice when my ketones are above 1 millimolar, not only am I less hungry, but I don't get symptomatic when my blood glucose goes down to 60 milligrams per deciliter, which normally I consider low. I may have lost some hypoglycemia awareness over the years from diabetes, but I still get symptoms at this glucose level when my ketone levels are lower. So to support this type of fasting and restricting my feeding window, I'm working on building a model into my open source system to support this type of fasting. And this shows what I've started building. And I show it to you because it's an estimate for how your insulin sensitivity increases when reducing your feeding window or fasting. Again, I'm building some of this in software. It's a hacked model for counteracting increased insulin sensitivity from fasting. And I use higher glucose targets. Don't misinterpret this graph. I don't expect my glucose to rise when I'm fasting. That orange bar shows insulin sensitivity is higher. But I used increased glucose targets to hack my insulin pump to make it think like I want higher glucose. Because the way the algorithms work, then it will give me less insulin because it thinks I want less insulin. Now, the alternative would be I could tune down my basal insulin rates, which would be easier to understand, but it's actually harder for me to test. And this model is much simpler for me to test. Now later, once I have this working, I can use basal insulin rates, and even I can do auto detection of fasting based on carb entries. That will take some work, maybe next year. Again, this is when I typically see fasting stabilizes for me. It's usually towards the end of day 1, but certainly that time period could vary. Maybe it's hour 18, maybe it's day 2. But typically you see some level of stability here where you need much less insulin. So it's good to continue that fast and maintain that insulin sensitivity, give your pancreas a break like we talked about. Now, low carb, low insulin, reducing your eating window. Those are 100x changes in terms of impacts on your diabetes risk. Walking more and moving more, and the next 2 actions are closer to 10x changes. They're important. But as you've ever heard, you can't outrun or out-exercise a bad diet. The same applies here. Low carb and fasting are dietary changes. Moving more and adding muscle will not overcome a diet that's built to store fat. whether from too much insulin or carbs or total calories. But still, walking more increases your insulin sensitivity. It can help improve sleep and stress for many people, and poor sleep, too much stress can raise your glucose levels. And walking and low intensity movement directly burns glucose. Many people, including me, see a roughly 1 milligram per deciliter per minute drop in glucose from walking, depending on speed, intensity, and other factors. So that equates to like a 30 milligram per deciliter drop in glucose for a 30-minute walk. So if your glucose is 140, you're almost back down to normal at 110 after a half hour. For reference, I use 83 milligrams per deciliter as my normal based on what I read from Dr. Bernstein and his testing. For me, I start getting headaches around 140 milligrams per deciliter, and I feel fine around 100. My goal is in the 80s with a standard deviation of 20 milligrams per deciliter or less. I'm not there yet, closer to 100, and a 25 to 30 standard deviation. Now the recommendation here is to walk every hour. Just move for 5 minutes. And it's not always possible, and that's fine. Don't worry when you don't do it, just do it as often as you can. If you have a device that reminds you to stand or move every hour, use that as a trigger to walk. I go outside, even in the winter when it's cold, because it wakes me up. And when it's raining, I grab an umbrella. Keep an umbrella by your door. Taking a longer walk once per day will help you burn glucose, like I mentioned earlier. The longer walk gives you the bigger insulin sensitivity benefits. Now, in an ideal world, you take that longer walk right before or right after a big meal. And remember, if you don't want to walk, that's fine. Substitute rowing, biking, swimming. You can do light sports work. I do shadow boxing and jump rope and hit the heavy bag, but always at a much lighter intensity than if I was training for a competition. Now, I mentioned that walking burns glucose, and this is the model I picture in my head. Again, it's not published research, even though it looks like a semi-professional graph. I drew it based on what's in my head from my own N-of-1 experiment. What I see from walking is that my glucose drops after 20 minutes or so, and it's generally pretty linear. The numbers on the glucose levels or the insulin sensitivity are not precise. They're estimates based on the average response I've seen relative to my baseline at minute 0. At some point, again, I want to build an override algorithm into my open source loop system to trigger increasing my insulin sensitivity, like the orange line in the graph. That's what you should really pay attention to. The orange line is increased insulin sensitivity. And eventually I'd like to trigger this override to automatically happen based on Apple Health data on my phone. Again, that's the sweet spot for me for increasing sensitivity. The longer the better, up to a point. But once I hit 20 minutes or so, when I go back to eating or doing whatever it is I'm doing, I noticed increased insulin sensitivity even after I stopped walking for at least a few hours. Now, the next 10x change action I recommend is to add more muscle. Now, if you're a bodybuilder, I wouldn't recommend it, but most people could use more muscle. As Dr. Attia says, no one on their deathbed ever said, "I wish I had less leg strength." Leg strength is a focus. So we could all use more muscle, particularly in our legs. Adding more muscle increases your insulin sensitivity. And muscles are literally a storage depot for glucose and glycogen, really. So you give your body more flexibility where to store glucose, which is good for glycemic control when you have bigger muscles. So what should you do to add muscle? I don't care. If you have a program that works for you, go for it. If you find a program or a trainer you like, go for it. If it were me, I would focus on compound movements. And for reference, a compound movement is a squat, like you can see in the GIF on the screen with the fictional lady constantly squatting. Looks like she's doing a front squat. So compound movements require multiple big joints. An isolated movement will be a bicep curl. Now, I'm not knocking curls. There's nothing wrong with curls. But your glutes and quads and your chest and your back are much bigger muscles, and that's what you use when you do compound movements. Compound movements train more big muscles per unit of time invested. For me, if I could only train 3 exercises for the rest of my life, I would do squats, pull-ups, and burpees. Again, you can see the squats. You probably know what pull-ups are. Look up burpees if you don't know them. And I'm sorry, burpees are hard. But in fact, there's a guy who did nothing but burpees and maybe some pull-ups and a little running until he got to 25,000 burpees done over the period of years. And he was in tremendous physical condition. You don't need a complicated program. You can start slow and work your way up. For me, I would train at least twice a week. Train more often if you want. But make sure your muscles are growing. Else, give your body time to recover. And if that doesn't work, you may need to eat more, which is counterintuitive given the fasting recommendation. But me, I wouldn't fast the day after a hard weight training workout if I was just starting out with weight training. I would make sure I was getting enough calories those days. For me, I have a good amount of muscle, so I weight train during my fasts. I even weight train during that multi-day fast that I showed my stats on. And other people who fast more often than me, they do the same thing. They weight train when they fast, and they're not losing muscle. In fact, they weight train during fasts to preserve muscle. Listen to Dr. Atia's AMAs if you're interested in this. Again, links will be in the resources at the end. Now, you might think I'd recommend high-intensity exercise, right? Isn't harder better? Yeah, maybe, but not necessarily. High intensity is great. If you're doing that or want to do it, great. Keep doing it. But low and moderate intensity burns glucose and makes you more sensitive to insulin, like I mentioned. High intensity, particularly max effort sprints, whether it's running, rowing, or biking, spikes my blood glucose. This is a common phenomenon, since a sprint is like fight or flight mode, and your liver releases glycogen when that happens in case you need it. And if you want, listen to a particular podcast with Dr. Atia, number 85 with Inigo San Milan. You'll learn why training at your lactate threshold is important for maximum mitochondrial performance. And I believe it's also great for fat burning. And if you don't know, a proxy for lactate threshold is the hardest you can train while still maintaining a conversation. For anyone used to high intensity training, that level of training is not very hard. But for reducing your diabetes risk, it's very effective. Again, this is not published research. I drew it based on what's in my head. This is what generally happens to me after weight training. This is what happens to my insulin sensitivity. That's the orange line. Generally, I see increased sensitivity after a weight training workout, and it drops back down to baseline, typically the next day. That's day 2 on the graph. And for reference, I typically weight train between 5 to 7 p.m. Now, if the weight training isn't very intense, I might not see any increased insulin sensitivity the following night. But if it's intense, I always see a big increase in sensitivity the next night or 2. And if it's heavy weight training, particularly heavy leg weight training, my body literally sucks up glucose, especially when it feels like I have DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness. When I'm sleeping those nights, my blood sugar will often go low or borderline, and I'll wake up briefly to eat a glucose tablet, sometimes every half hour to 1 hour, for 2 to 3 hours if it was really hard. Now, my Loop open source does a better job predicting and mitigating these lows, and I'm still working on a way to override this sensitivity, building a model like you can see on the screen, and maybe even detect it from Apple Health after weight training. Now, these are the top 5 areas I would monitor if I was on the path to diabetes. Diabetics should monitor these too, and I'll have a few more measurements for diabetics in a few slides. But why monitor all these things? Because they all either tell us a risk for diabetes, diabetes complication, or they may cause hyperglycemia or high blood glucose. So this last action, number 5, is a catch-all. And you might call it a cop-out for not picking a single action. You might say I'm not telling you what to do, and you might feel it's too complicated. And in some ways you're right, but let's make it simpler, because they're important. First, I'm not telling you what to do on these because that will require an even longer presentation, and we've been at this long enough. Most of these areas will improve tremendously from implementing one or more of the first 4 actions I presented. But other areas like sleep and stress take significant time to diagnose and treat, and you'll need a professional, not a 5-minute presentation or flow chart, to improve or fix those. Second, Make this simpler by tracking number one all the time. The rest don't need regular tracking unless you're off the rails or actively trying to improve those areas. For example, if I implemented the first action, reduce carbs and insulin, I would track the amount of carbs I was eating until I felt I was consistently low carb, and then I back off. And if you need a way to track carbs, most phones and devices nowadays, like those, give you a way to track your carb entries, and there are plenty of apps that do the same. Now, once I was low carb consistently, I back off. If I was doing something else, like number 2, trying to lose weight or fat from fasting, I would track body fat percentage weekly. Let's review each of these 5 items briefly. For the frequency of when to track, I'll assume you're not yet a diabetic. If you're already a diabetic, you might want to track them more frequently. Number 1, track your glucose levels with random spot checks, or at least an A1C a few times a year. The A1C will be a better indicator if you're trending in the right direction. But glucose checks are something you can do on your own at home. You just need to remember that a single glucose test doesn't tell you much about your trend, but they might give you information on what you've done in the last few hours, or even how last night's sleep or yesterday's stress affects your glucose. Number 2, track your carbs per day as a proxy for how much insulin your body is generating or using if you don't inject insulin. If you're on the path to diabetes, you want to give your pancreas a break. Low carb and fasting are the 2 best ways I know to do that. Management expert Peter Drucker said, "What gets measured gets managed," and we're using that principle here. If you force yourself to enter and look at your carb data, you're less likely to eat carbs. Again, remember, most vegetables are fine. Number 3, check your body fat weekly. You can check your weight too, but I don't pay much attention to weight. If you're severely obese, then large weight loss, like 10 to 20 pounds or more, indicates you lost fat. In our society, we talk about weight loss all the time, but we don't talk about fat losses as often. But I can lose 5 pounds of water in a day easily, and I can gain 5 pounds right back the next day from water. And that's frustrating if you're trying to lose weight. It feels like a roller coaster. But if you were monitoring fat, you wouldn't notice much of a difference in that example. Not only that, but will you be upset if you gain weight from adding muscle? Some people would. But we want more weight on our bodies, and sometimes we gain weight from that. But gaining muscle is a great thing. The weight gain is minor in terms of your health, up to a point. And if you used a body fat monitor and gain muscle, you'd actually see your body fat go down, since muscle would make up a higher proportion of your body composition relative to fat. Now, I use a cheap Omron electrical monitor to measure my body fat. It's not as accurate as other methods, but those are typically more expensive and less convenient. But it is precise, meaning if I take 3 measurements, they're generally within 0.5%, as long as I drink a couple glasses of water, and I typically do this measurement first thing in the morning after going to the bathroom. Now, if I gain or lose 1 or 2% of fat, I have high confidence that it's a real change, not an issue with the device. I would measure body fat weekly to avoid worrying too much about the day-to-day fluctuations. In fact, I pay more attention to 2 to 3 week trends. 1 week, I might randomly see my body fat up or down 0.5%. If that trend continues the next week, I have more confidence something is happening that I should pay attention to. But often that trend doesn't continue. So if I paid attention to it the week prior, it would have been wasted energy. Now, number 4, sleep. Are you sleeping long enough? Do you wake up refreshed? Do you feel fatigued during the day? If you're sleeping 7 to 8 or more hours per night, you wake up refreshed, and you don't feel like you need to go back to sleep during the day, I wouldn't spend time tracking sleep. But if I was sleeping 6 hours per night, I track my sleep duration. Almost any fitness tracker, watch, and even some phone apps can do this. Some do it very well. Again, if you're tired during the day, you can start with increasing sleep duration. You can also look at sleep staging and getting enough deep sleep, which I've done personally. Increasing my deep sleep has helped my daytime fatigue and feeling refreshed when I wake up. I have a ton more energy since I've almost doubled my deep sleep. But remember, those tracking devices, as of 2020, don't typically give highly accurate readings on sleep stages. But if you find a tracker you like, you might be able to gauge improvements in deep sleep or other stages using relative changes, if they're precise. For example, my ring tells me I used to sleep, on average, 20 minutes of deep sleep per night. Again, it might not be accurate. Maybe it's more, maybe it's less. But who knows? But as of right now, these devices are significantly off compared to a formal sleep study when it comes to measuring stages. But they're good at sleep duration and some other items. For me, when I was at 20 minutes before, I knew when I increased my deep sleep to 40 minutes and then 60 minutes that I'd significantly increased deep sleep. And not only that, I felt better. And I don't think it was just a placebo. So a large relative change compared to a baseline is a good indicator, even if the measurements aren't exactly accurate. If they're at least precise, you can use them for relative measure tracking. Okay, last one, number 5. Track your stress if you feel like you're overwhelmed, overworked, anxious, or depressed. Now, you might not be able to sense these states in yourself if you've dealt with them for a long time. It might be your normal. So I would ask someone I trust who sees me often, how often and how severely stressed am I? Because stress can both spike your glucose if you have acute stress, or generally raise your levels if you're chronically stressed. You can also use a fitness tracker here to help with monitoring. I use my overnight resting heart rate as an indicator of my overall stress level. And obviously my Dexcom glucose sensor can detect acute changes because I'll see a blood glucose spike. So I use my overnight resting heart rate, but there are many confounders that could raise that number, so you have to be aware of that. But if the number goes down, I'm usually doing a good job managing stress. And if I have a highly stressful day, my overnight low resting heart rate normally goes up. Heart rate variability is another one you can use, similar to resting heart rate. You can also just get a notebook or a spreadsheet and graph your mood on a 1 to 10 scale and check your trend. At least you'll have a subjective measurement. Now, you might have some very real constraints affecting your ability to improve sleep or stress. Maybe it's a job, a boss, your family, your kids, a disease, your finances. I don't know your situation. I can only tell you what I ask myself in these situations when something like a job is causing me to lose sleep or stress. Is this job worth 5 to 10 years of my life? You could replace job with any other major issue causing you to lose sleep, or stress out. And some of them will sound ridiculous. Is this kid worth 5 to 10 years of my life? Yes, they are. They're my kids. That one sounds ridiculous because we love our kids. At least I do. But is this job worth 5 to 10 years of my life? That also sounds ridiculous. No, almost no job is worth 5 to 10 years of your life. And I ask the question that way because that's what we're talking about. If you get diabetes, if you manage it poorly, you're losing on average 5 to 10 years of your life, maybe more. And sometimes all the good sleep improvement programs, stress reduction techniques, meditation, supplements, and all those things that sometimes you get from workplace and your benefits, sometimes those things won't make a dent compared to changing what's driving the problem. Just like you can't outrun a bad diet, you can't outrun a bad environment. Okay, that's a lot to cover. Reach out if you have more questions on these. I want to add a couple more things on the A1C now, and then we will wrap up. The HbA1c is not the only measurement you can use or should use to predict your risk for diabetes. Think about your family history of diabetes, your weight, and really your body fat, lifestyle and behaviors. Again, are you sedentary? What's your diet, sleep, stress level? And you could ask for other tests like an oral glucose tolerance test, C-peptide test. Talk to your doctor. But the A1C is available to most people through workplace or insurance biometric screening programs. Now, if it's going up, like in this graph, from 5 to 5.5 the next year to 6 the next year, you're going to be a diabetic. It's just a question of when. Unless you take actions immediately. Now, again, you want a doctor to interpret your results, particularly if this isn't clear. But remember, a good A1C does not guarantee that you're not on the path to diabetes. You may produce a ton of insulin to keep your blood glucose normal for a long time before your average blood sugar rises. Your pancreas is working overtime. Eventually it will tap out. That's why if you have a family history or less healthy behaviors, or you're overweight, you want to ask your doctor for another way to assess your risk, like maybe oral glucose tolerance test, or what they'd recommend. But again, if you have central trunk obesity, it's worth looking at other things besides your A1C if it's normal. A1C only measures your glucose level, but those other tests, the OGTT, C-peptide, they can give a doctor a sense of how much insulin you're producing or measure it directly. You may have normal glucose levels for years while your pancreas is working overtime, producing tons of insulin, and again, that puts you at high risk of getting type 2. You want to find this information out as soon as possible, because the longer your body works like this, the more likely you'll lose more of those insulin-producing cells. And high insulin is associated with lower mortality. So use the A1C if you see this trend, but don't get too comfortable if you see a normal number and you have other risk factors. And again, there are more limitations with those A1Cs. This graph shows an example of 3 different A1Cs that all represent 7%. Because A1C is a proxy for your average glucose level over a 2 to 3 month period, or however long your red blood cells live. The A1C is the main report card diabetics and their doctors use to assess your health from a diabetes perspective. But if you're a data nerd, you might already notice some problems. Again, you can see some wide variability in those 3 lines that all represent a 7.0% A1C. And that's the problem with averages. The highs counteract the lows. But high blood sugar is bad and low blood sugar is bad. You need the Goldilocks protocol. Your blood sugar needs to be just right, to feel good, and have normal health. And that represents why my behavior didn't change much my first 20 years with diabetes. I had 6% A1C for years. Again, the doctors didn't pay much attention to me. They had more important patients to deal with. And I thought I was fine. But I was that black or red line above. That's not good. Now I'm closer to the green. I listened to, again, Dr. Pediatria. He wears a CGM even though he's not a diabetic. And he talked a lot about standard deviation, keeping that number around 10. And then I read a diatribe article about the limitations of A1C and the benefits of other measurements like time and range. You can see 2 different time and range measurements here. Time and range is the amount of time you spend in a specific glucose range, with a minimum glucose target and a maximum glucose target. 70 to 180 milligrams per deciliter is the typical target time and range, but you can customize your targets. So you can see on the left, the 50% time and range shows relatively stable glucose from 12 a.m. to 12 p.m. if you look at the black line, which represents the actual glucose measurement, not the targets, which are the blue dotted lines, horizontal dotted lines. But then you see on the left, high glucose the rest of the day. Again, that horizontal line of blue dots represents the minimum target at 70, and the top is the maximum target at 180. Your goal is to have your glucose between those 70 to 180 blue dot lines as much as possible. So because they were within range the first half of the day and out of range the second half of the day, the time in range is 50%. The second time in range graph on the right is easy to read. The black line representing glucose values is between the blue dotted lines the whole day. You need a glucose within range 100% of the time. Do you know what that day feels like? It feels like you're a normal person. It feels pretty good. But me, I still get headaches above 140 milligrams per deciliter. So I'll explain on the next slide why I customize my time and range to a tighter window. See, I switched to a Dexcom CGM a few years ago during all of my health issues. And that CGM, continuous glucose monitor, it gives you data-rich reports like you can see here. I focused more on standard deviation and time and range as my primary measurements for diabetic health. You can see a lot of data on this screen, but standard deviation and time and range are circled in red. 25 is my standard deviation. That number ranges from the mid-20s to the lower 30s for me now. It used to be the mid-30s or the high 40s before all of these health issues and my improvements. It might have even been the 50s or higher at some point. Targeting 10 is what Dr. Tia uses, and that might be impossible or demoralizing for a type 1 like me. But 20 to 25 keeps me stable and isn't overwhelming and doesn't require too much effort. And I feel good when I keep my number there. On the right, circled in red, is the time and range. Again, standard is 70 to 180. I set a tighter window of 70 to 140. But even with that tighter and more aggressive target range, my lows are still only 3 to 5%. And I'm normally in range 70 to 90% of the time. For me, better standard deviation and time and range means I wake up less from alarms, from my CGM, or feeling awful when I'm sleeping, whether I've got a CGM or not, from a high blood sugar or low blood sugar. It also means my wife doesn't have to wake me up and say, you're beeping again. And that makes me happy. That makes her happy. Bad sleep is bad for blood sugar, like I said. So, better sleep is a positive, vicious cycle for improving blood glucose and diabetes control. So because of the limitations of some of the existing measurements, diabetics should also monitor these if possible. Number 1, insulin is relatively easy to measure if you have a pump. Now, if you inject, keep a running tally of your injections and basal rate and add it up at the end of the day. Keep that number somewhere. You can list it next to future measurements, maybe a notebook, maybe a spreadsheet, so you can track trends. If you're fasting or reducing carbs, you will want to see less insulin usage, and you will. Again, as I explained earlier, less insulin usage is generally better up to a point for most people. Now, number 2 and number 3, track standard deviation and time and range if you have a CGM or continuous glucose sensor. Now, you can track these if you're testing with a glucometer, but it's less convenient and it's more beneficial with more data. And better yet, if you don't have a CGM, get one. If you're a diabetic, you should. Even if you're pre-diabetic, if you can get approved for one, get one. Nothing changes your habits faster than getting real-time feedback on how they're impacting your glucose. Read some of the diatribe articles that are linked on my website to determine what targets to set for standard deviation and time and range, and how to use that data. For me, unstable glucose feels like I'm on a roller coaster. It feels like frustration, stress, anxiety, and a lack of control over life. Getting a CGM and focusing on these measurements are the triggers for taking the actions that help you take back control of your life. They don't tell you exactly what actions to take, but they tell you whether your actions are working or not. So again, nothing beats real-time feedback and actionable metrics. If you improve time and range and lower standard deviation, you will feel more in control. And not only that, you will feel better. And you will be better. A better controlled diabetic. So I'm just this guy with crazy hair talking about diabetes. But what happened to me? How does my story end? I don't know. I can only tell you where I am. I implemented the Dr. Bernstein protocols, started tracking these numbers, and added an open source loop system, which I didn't talk about today, which really helped take much of the burden off planning how I manage diabetes. But I needed all these things. And you can do it without an insulin pump. Now, on top of these recent changes, I've been adding muscle and moving more for a couple decades. Anybody who knows me will attest to that. But what happened after I did all these things? Well, after 2 months on these protocols, my A1C reduced from 6 to 5.5%. And that last graph that I showed from my Dexcom report shows an example of my standard deviation and time and range from that time period. It only got better. 5.5% A1C. That's a normal A1C. That's a normal A1C for a type 1 diabetic who makes no insulin. That's hard. Again, my time and range went up to 70 to 90% on a tighter window, and my standard deviation was down in the mid-20s. On top of all those measurements, my heart rate variability started increasing from the mid-20 milliseconds to about 40 milliseconds. Better and increased heart rate variability is a good thing. My resting heart rate dropped from the mid-50s to the high 40s. Again, that's a good thing. My deep sleep doubled. My glucose levels are more predictable, and my life is more predictable. But more importantly, I feel better. When I wake up, I have more mental energy. Those glucose levels make my life easier. I can think more clearly. I have less headaches. My glucose levels are stable, and I feel more stable. I don't spend nearly as much time thinking about diabetes. I don't waste as much time feeling awful when I'm high or confused when I'm low. I feel like I have more control over diabetes in my life. Because I do. And that's important because I want to live a long time. Living a normal, long life with diabetes has always been my motivation and my goal. But if that's not enough, now I have this. I'm lucky to have a beautiful baby girl and my wife. I have a lot to live for. But that's just me. I'm just one person. But there are thousands and thousands of kids and adults following the Bernstein and Fung protocols. And many of them have better results than me. Again, no action is without risk, but these methods are safe and effective. These methods work. And if you're motivated, if you want to live a long, normal life with diabetes, if you have someone like this in your life, then I give this a shot. What do you have to lose? Maybe more importantly, what might you lose if you don't? Now, here are a few resources. There are more resources and direct links on mattdever.com/diabetes. I will continue to add more resources there as I find great material on reducing diabetes risk. If you're going low carb, order the Dr. Bernstein book. Start there. If you're type 1 or insulin dependent, it will simplify your life. And if you're type 2, it will give you a crash course in some of the best education you can find. Now, if you're overweight or pre-diabetic or type 2, check out the podcast with Dr. Jason Fung, or better yet, read the Diabetes Code. And again, he has a couple others, which I linked to on the website, including the Complete Guide to Fasting. There's plenty more there. Check it out. Now, if you know someone who has diabetes or might be on the path, share that link with them. I'm not the expert. I'm not trying to make money. I'm just a pointer to smarter data structures. I consume knowledge from the smartest people in the world on diabetes. I look for novel approaches that can lead to better results than the horrendous ones we see now. And I just put up a link to them. Sometimes I run experiments on myself to see what works and what doesn't, and I write about that experience. Again, find all that on my site, mattdever.com. Now, I wish you a life free of diabetes or its complications for you and your family and friends. Reach out to me anytime. I'd love to hear from you. I'm Matt Dever. Until we meet again, good day.